some of the conversation today in all of Canada, realistically, because we're seeing it rear its little head again in Quebec also, this concept of separation and division of powers between province and the federal government. So today I want to talk a little bit about the fractured Canada, which we're living in. And it's fractured, I think, not only economically, but also ideologically. I think Canada has a little bit lost its way. We don't know who we are as a country anymore in this post-nation state, as Justin Trudeau likes to call it. So the other one I want to talk about is, and it ties into that because we talk about diverging paths. And I think Alberta's path is diverging a little bit from not only the federal government, but from that of some of the rest of Canada. And I think a large part of that is due to a lot of these socialist policies that we are seeing. And I think, we keep saying Alberta is this last bastion of freedom in Canada. And let's explore whether or not that's actually true. Federal policies are, I think, certainly shifting away from what traditionally have been our foundation, our moral standard, as well as the fact that we have been a democratic, capitalistic society. And then I want to talk a little bit about the rural and urban divide that we're seeing and how policy is being played out, and how I think some of the unequal representation that we find in our cities like Edmonton and Calgary here in Alberta are having a bigger impact politically than some of the rural communities. And then we can discuss whether that's right or wrong. Could Alberta, and this is where I guess I'm kind of going with all of this, could Alberta be the model that we can use for the rest of Canada? And can we also use some of the policies and some of the tactics taken already that we've seen in Quebec, for example, and implement some of those policies here to get a better deal for Alberta? Or is separation really our only alternative? So those are some of the things I want to kind of get your feedback on. What do you think? Is Canada still the country that you grew up in? Is this still the country that you're, proud to be a part of? And do you still travel in the same way and say, hey, I'm proud to be a Canadian? I know for me, a lot of that has changed. And I have some grave concerns about the country that I once thought to be and so proudly spoke of. And it's not what I recall it to be. So I want to talk a little bit about the diverging paths and whether or not you think Alberta is and can be that model. And is Canada actually breaking apart? You're seeing separation discussed more and more now in Quebec. The federal government under the Liberal Party is a mess. There is no support for the Liberal Party. It's polling at, I think, like 22%. I think even the Liberals and the NDP combined right now do not even show the same level of support. If you take Quebec out of the picture altogether, for the rest of Canada, I think the Conservatives are like 50%. So a major majority. So a real shift that's happening, and be really kind of curious to dig into as to why that's happening. I think people begin to realize policies when they actually impact them directly. And I think we're seeing the impact right now, some really bad policies, both economically and ideologically from the Liberal government. But you're seeing now the Bloc Quebecois propping up the Liberal government against, literally, this is an act that violates the rights of pretty much every other province and the majority of citizens within Canada. And they are just concerned with their own self-interest. And they're in this for whatever they can get out of it for themselves, for Quebec. Right or wrong, maybe we should all be taking a look at looking after our own self-interest first, and maybe take a couple of notes there and try a couple of moves out of the playbook from Quebec. So, are we witnessing reemergence, I think, of conversation around separation and, this slow fracture of Canada? And we are definitely seeing more and more provinces pull away from the central authority of what we call Ottawa and this federal government, rightly so. And, I think the Constitution is extremely broken. I think it's violating not only the rights of individuals, but the jurisdiction and the rights of the provinces to govern their people based upon their economic needs and their ideological beliefs. So you have this overarching, overbearing federal government right now that's become very totalitarian, very dictator. People are beginning to resist, not only now individuals, but you're seeing provinces like Alberta, Saskatchewan, even in some respects, BC is pushing back. So let's explore some of, what's going on here and what can we do about it. Looking at Western separation, let's take a look at some of the federal policies that, indicate the West in particular is moving away from this federal overreach of the federal government, but also how individual provinces are now, and the individuals within those provinces, whether it be BC all the way through to Newfoundland, Labrador, are beginning to try and find ways to insulate themselves, to be honest. And they want to just have a little more control over their own destiny and to chart their own course, which is the way that Confederation was actually intended. But as we've learned, intention and reality are not always aligned. The Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and we're going to talk a little bit about that because the Bill of Rights here in Alberta is being discussed at the moment. And, everybody, when I grew up and the people that I talked to, I thought we had guaranteed rights in this country. And COVID really opened the eyes of a lot of people, myself included, at just how quickly the government can trample, and you can't trample the right. If we're given a God-given right to life, liberty, and property, there is no government on this planet that can take that away from you. So what I've learned is that we don't have God-given rights that are enshrined in law in Canada any longer. What we have are privileges called rights that have been granted by governments, but they're privileges, and those privileges can be taken away at any point in the future, now or otherwise, and we saw that with COVID, if they deem it necessary. So let's take a look at Alberta. Alberta's economy, despite the federal government's best efforts to absolutely destroy our economy. Some people would say stifle. I would say, actual full-on attack our economy. Despite all of that, Alberta is still growing. We have an abundance of natural resources. We have an abundance of talent. The people here are absolutely innovative, creative, and I would say perseverant. That is probably, when I think about Albertans, I think about perseverance and resistance. They are just, I think, accustomed to hardship and to having to fight for what they want and what they believe. And they're not going to back down easily, much to the chagrin even to the provincial government here, which we're seeing right now had kind of hoped, I think, to sweep some of the promises that they had made about reforms to human rights, about reforms made to taxes, about reforms made to other areas that affect the individual here in Alberta. And they wanted, I think, to sweep some of that under the rug. And Albertans are just not going to allow that to happen. When we believe in something strongly, especially our rights and our freedoms, they're going to stand and they're going to fight for those. So economically, we're growing. And I want to talk a little bit about demographically how Alberta is very different from the rest of Canada. Peter Zeihan actually did a really good analogy of this in his books, where he talks about each of the different countries. And within each of those countries, he finds the exceptions. And so if you look at, the United States, you look at the UK, you look at some of the other European countries, you look at Canada, we have pretty much an aging population. And he refers to this in the pyramid, and how a healthy pyramid should be very small at the top, that's your older population, and very large at the bottom with your younger population. And that should remain in the shape of a pyramid. That's not happening any longer. Canada is kind of very fat in the middle to the top with a very slim bottom at the moment. And so that is not a healthy economic situation to find yourself in. And the reason being is because we have social programs like the Canada Pension Plan that basically is, for lack of a better word, a Ponzi scheme. It's an in and out system. You have the younger generation that is basically payrolling the retirement of its older population. Now, if you've got a much smaller base at the bottom, you've got much fewer people. So that means you're going to have to tax them more, take more from them in revenue in order to finance this much larger bubble at the top of retirees. Alberta is the exception. Alberta has a younger population. And Alberta, because of its natural resources and its natural wealth, and because of its, I think, democratic capitalist environment and structure, more so, it bucks that trend. And that has real implications for both Alberta and for Canada. So it's never ever made sense to me as to why the federal government is trying so hard to shut the Alberta economy down, because it is right now the economic engine. It is one of the few provinces that is contributing, that allows them to continue their social spending, which is completely out of control. Then what happens if that goes away? Right? It's just, I mean, they've borrowed. You can only borrow so much. There's severe consequences to that. That's a whole other video. But while other areas are aging, other areas are shrinking demographically and shrinking economically, Alberta is thriving. And that brings us to a big question. Is Alberta moving in a direction that is compatible with the rest of Canada? We are being attacked. We are being resisted in more ways than one. Let's talk about equalization payments. Alberta has sent almost $67 billion to the federal government in equalization payments. And yet, instead of getting support and a thank you for that, what we get is hostility. And not only hostility from Canada, but also hostility from the other provinces. They want a bigger share now of that money. And especially Quebec, who's gotten the majority of that over the years. Nobody stands to say, hey, wait a minute, maybe Alberta is getting a raw deal here and is not getting a fair shake. We're not being fairly represented. They're quite happy to take our money, but not happy to give us any support when we need it for things like pipelines. Well, we're an oil and gas, we're a natural resource province. And simply put, if we can't produce the dollars, well, there's nothing for anybody to be had. And yet we can't ask the other provinces in the rest of Canada, and especially Quebec, for their support to help us in the continuation of generating that revenue, which all Canadians benefit from. So, Quebec benefits from these payments. Other parts of Canada benefit from these payments, and yet we end up with legislation like Bill C-63 that just tried to shut down our entire ability not only to build pipelines, but any infrastructure. So, how long is it that Alberta is expected to continue to fund the rest of Canada, especially when we're getting nothing in return? So that the equalization payments is a big one. And Albertans had a referendum on equalization. And the reality is 62% of Albertans would love to see equalization end, period. Again, that will tell you that people just do not see the value for the dollars that are being spent. With $67 billion that we've given to Canada, that is money that we could have left right here in this province to spend on our own citizens, and hopefully to make life better for them here. We're seeing an economic decline, GDP per capita, and a quality of life declining for every Canadian right now, despite whatever the federal government and the Liberals are trying to mask in this belief that GDP is growing. Well, the number of immigrants that they've had to bring into the country to keep GDP growing, and this is a false flag. This is truly is a mask of the problems that exist with our aging population, with the fact that we have very little productivity, and things need to change on a whole other level for us to correct that problem. So Alberta had, when Danielle Smith took the reins of the United Conservative Party, came into power with what's called the Alberta Sovereignty Act. And this was a clear message again from Albertans that, the federal government is overreaching into provincial jurisdiction, and that we feel the need to have to protect ourselves from this overreach. And, the harms that have been happening through policies from the federal government, there is a need right now to have to preserve our provincial autonomy. There is no doubt about it. Is this the first step for Alberta potentially leaving Canada altogether? That's a question that some people have asked. What do you think? Should Alberta be fighting for a better deal with Canada? Should we stay within Canada? Should we be looking at this as a first step to leaving altogether? And it'll be really interesting when we talk about some of the constitutional changes that would need to happen for Alberta to even get a fair deal within Canada. When you have Ontario and Quebec under the Constitution, they have to approve of any and every change that is proposed in order to see it passed for constitutional change. So how is it that Alberta is going to be able to get a fair deal if we remain within Canada when Ontario and Quebec have to? Not 7 of the 10 or 7 of the 12. It's Quebec and Ontario have to approve, and then we have to have, I think, 2 of the western provinces and 2 of the 4 eastern provinces, in addition to that, approve in order any change that's proposed. So that's a real big uphill battle. Let me know where you stand. Leave a comment. Share your thoughts by all means. The federal policies that have significantly hurt Alberta, and we're seeing, the federal government, as well as some of the provincial governments, shift more and more to socialist policies. BC has been run by the NDP for a long, long time. You're seeing the harms that have come from that and those policies. Now you're beginning to see people go back to more conservatives and supporting the conservative ideology a little bit more. Why? Because they're actually feeling the outcome of the socialist policies that the NDP and the BC region has, for years now been implementing. And every province has been doing this, going further and further to the left, further and further into this socialist ideology, and rejecting common sense, conservative, traditional values. And, programs and policies focus on primarily the urban areas, Edmonton and Calgary, with their populations of now 1 million plus in each. They have outnumbered the rural areas, and they have a totally different outlook and a totally different perspective on things than rural Albertans. I ran many years ago for the People's Party of Canada, 2021, 2019. And in 2021, we have the Maverick Party that came out, and it was a Western party. But the problem, and I argued in the Western Party, was that this is not a West versus East. This is an ideological problem. And the problem is that we have socialists that are butting up against conservatives. And we also see that primarily focused in rural versus urban areas. The rural areas are more, keep the government out of my private life, get the government out of my way, we can take care of ourselves. And it's the opposite in these big rural centers. You want to see more and more government interference, more and more government control over their lives. And they, every time there's a little problem, they want the government to solve it. Whereas in rural Alberta, you just want, government, get out of my way, we'll fix our own problems. So there's a real ideological difference and a real shift that, and I don't know how you reconcile that, honestly. And I think today, even within the Conservative Party here provincially, what we see is we've got different groups that have kind of come in under this conservative umbrella, but don't necessarily believe in true blue conservative ideals. So you have this fiscal conservative that is socially liberal. Now, okay, that means you're liberal, okay? That doesn't make you a conservative, in my opinion. So you have to take a hard look at, where do conservatives, true blue conservatives, go today to find themselves a home? I have spoken and have seen so many comments from so many individuals, especially these last few months, who feel like they do not have a home politically. They do not belong. And so what they're opted to do, unfortunately, is just stop participating in the democratic process. They have just decided that, it doesn't matter who I elect or what I do. It just doesn't make a difference. I don't belong. And therefore, they are just not casting their ballots. They're choosing not to be involved in politics at all, which I think is sad, because we then hand things over to the other side, which we need to be the resistance. We have to push back harder on those in the socially conservative area to say, no, you've gone too far. We have to be the ones to pull them back. Otherwise, we're just going to continue marching further and further and further to the left. And that is not what we want to see. That is not good for our democracy, certainly not good for freedom, certainly not good for Alberta. Carbon tax, is another perfect example of programs that have been forced upon provinces, the federal government, in their federal overreach, in my opinion. Again, I know the Supreme Court has ruled on this, but, to tax, and we're taxed to death as it already is here in Canada. But the carbon tax, has been challenged. You're seeing it now in BC, Newfoundland, Labrador. You're seeing it in Saskatchewan, who's refused to pay it on their utilities. Alberta challenging it. Where does the federal government, get the right to overstep jurisdiction and force upon its citizens, something as unpopular as a carbon tax? You're seeing this as well here with Pierre Poilievre now saying he's going to axe the tax. Nobody in Canada wants this, and yet it is being rammed down our throats, and it inadvertently, I think, and disproportionately affects provinces like Alberta, Saskatchewan included in that as well, because we are very heavily invested in farming and oil and other natural resource production. So 82% of Albertans feel that Ottawa's policies are harming our province. And considering the fact that we contribute billions upon billions of dollars in equalization payments, but the federal government continues to spend and prioritize in provinces like Quebec, carbon tax, again, they get special rates, whereas the rest of the country is paying more for the carbon tax. It's just not working. So we definitely have a system that's broken, and how do we fix that? Alberta, is definitely being treated very unfairly as it relates to other parts of Canada. And how long do we allow this to continue? Equalization, how do we rebalance the deck that's been stacked against us here? Again, let me know. Share in the comments. I want to talk about personal freedoms, because Alberta is currently discussing Alberta rights. And one of those Alberta rights, obviously medical choice, and making sure that you're not forced into any medical decision beyond your will. it needs to go beyond just forcing an individual, coercing an individual into medical procedures. We have to have protections to ensure that the government cannot punish its citizens for making those decisions. So when we take a look at the federal government during the COVID days, Justin Trudeau today says, I didn't force anybody to take a vaccine. And he's not necessarily wrong. He didn't sit on you and jab you with a needle. He just coerced you and forced you from a perspective of, well, if you want to feed your family and go to work each day, well, then you're going to have a vaccine. So, but that's not forcing anything upon your bodily autonomy. So what we need is protection from our own government. So no matter what is written in the Alberta Bill of Rights, it has to have language and such that we are protected from the ramifications of a government that decides to overreach and has its own system, to the judiciary, the judicial system, that can then enforce its laws upon us. There needs to be protections that are undisputable. The language has to be written in such a way that it is indisputable what the intent is and that what the law can enforce. And we need protection against punishment. We cannot be inadvertently, in my opinion, punished for making a medical decision. So on that issue of personal freedoms as well, Alberta is also discussing the right and the inclusion of gun rights and gun ownership. I'm very curious to see as to whether or not our Premier is willing to go so far as to include the language that was provided to her by the Black Hats here in Alberta, which includes the right to bear arms. A citizen that has no right to defend itself cannot protect itself from its own government. It's as simple as that. There needs to be protection of gun ownership and gun rights in this country. And you know what, if we can put up a better fight here in Alberta. One of the things that's concerned me is Danielle Smith has made comments like, well, you know, it needs to be legislation that we know is going to get passed and is not going to be disputed at the federal level. Well, you can be rest assured it's going to be disputed at the federal level no matter what we put in the Alberta Bill of Rights. And in fact, I would argue that's the point. We want to have the dispute. So I'm not hopeful, but we'll see what language she comes out with around gun rights and ownership. I would push that she make sure that Albertans have the right to bear arms. And we'll see what she actually comes out with. And again, you know, you've got people who live in the cities who see gun violence, but that's not legal gun owners who are responsible and know how to use their firearms and use them for sport shooting, use them for hunting. These are, you know, typically illegal guns that are, you know, bought across the border and used by criminals. So we need to get tougher on crime. Not tougher on law-abiding citizens. So just for those people who watch and live in the cities and go, well, I'm against guns. Well, the guns aren't the problem. It's calling the pencil and saying, hey, the pencil's the problem because you didn't like what somebody wrote. Well, the pencil's not the problem. If you had to choose your own personal freedoms, I mean, do you think, A, they're under attack today? And if you had to write out, you know, rank those personal freedoms that are most important to you, you know, where do things like freedom of speech, you know, freedom of religion, freedom of bodily autonomy, where do they fit in? Let me know. Share in the comments. This rural-urban divide, I've already talked a little bit about that, but it's impossible to ignore. We've got, you know, cities that are dictating to the rural communities now how things are going to be for them. And you've got, you know, cities like Toronto and Montreal that, in particular, where the federal government panders for their votes, that are just completely dominating the political landscape. And unfortunately, you know, for provinces like Alberta and Saskatchewan that have a larger rural population and a larger conservative population and a larger agricultural center and a larger, you know, oil and gas, natural resource, the policies that you're seeing around climate change and otherwise is really significantly hurting provinces like Alberta. rural areas, you know, they're hardworking people, like, and Canadians in general are pretty hardworking individuals, but rural folks that grew up on the farm and grew up with an agricultural background and in our natural resource, it's dirty work, it's hard work, and they have become self-sufficient and rely on themselves and their communities for assistance when they need it. And, you know, that is the true democratic values that we're seeing being eroded away here, even in our own province. So these urban centers are the ones that increasingly continue to move further and further left, progressive, liberal ideas, government-dependent policies, and this cultural divide, political divide, is deepening. And it's leaving rural Canadians feeling very alienated, in my opinion, like they don't have a home. It's kind of the same comment I made earlier with respect to, you know, those conservative votes that just no longer feel they have a home. You know, conservative seems to be in name only. It's certainly not represented in the values and the policies that get put forward. So how do we kind of rebalance that rural-urban divide when we look to shape and reshape not only, you know, Canada's future, but right, how do we do it right here in our own province? Is a great place to start. Sure, should the rural, you know, communities and Canadians have more say provincially, and how would we go about representing that? What would that look like? So we need better representation, I think, of all people, because the whole purpose of government is to protect the individual's rights. You know, the smallest minority is the individual, and law is supposed to be about ensuring that, you know, your rights can't infringe upon my rights. So how do we find that balance of striking that balance between, you know, ensuring that the rural communities are not, you know, being overshadowed by the urban centers just because of population? It's not just about values either. I mean, economically, we're seeing this happen. Urban voters, especially in Quebec and Ontario, don't understand how policies like carbon tax necessarily affect rural communities in the agriculture, the farming, energy, manufacturing. And I think we have a little bit of re-education that we do need to do to kind of bring people back to an economic understanding as to how these policies impact people adversely before we make decisions on them. So, you know, how are we going to address this economic divide? What policies could we implement, you know, that are more tailored for rural communities? Is there a balance that can be struck at all? What can we do? What can we do as Albertans? What can we do as Canadians? I think the fact that separation is kind of coming back up again and coming to the forefront, the problems are deepening. They're not actually getting better. One of the things I thought that Alberta could do and probably should do was the Alberta pension plan. Now, I've spoken about this across this province, and the truth is the Alberta pension plan is an equalization payment that we could stop making to Canada and start keeping here at home. I'd already alluded to the fact that 62% of Albertans in a referendum voted to stop equalization payments. Well, the Canada pension plan is an equalization payment to Canada to the tune of $3 to $5 billion a year that we could stop tomorrow. Why? Because all we have to do is send Canada notice. We are no longer participating in the Canada pension plan. We are establishing our own. We've got 3 years to get our affairs in order, and la-di-da, there you go, done. We've just saved ourselves $3 to $5 billion a year, and we'll take whatever we have as far as our share of the Canada pension plan, and we can do it and administer it ourselves here right in Alberta. I'm 100% convinced we can do it better, that more Albertans would receive better benefits. We can administer it better. I think it can be far more cost effective. I think it can be far less costly because it has a significant cost not only to the individual but to businesses as well. So many reasons why we should have an Alberta pension plan. And the political clout, I think that it would give by withdrawing from the Canada pension plan. I know people don't want, things like that to be used as political tools, but when you have something as powerful as sending a message that, hey, we don't need you to administer a Canada pension plan, we can do it right here at home, and take back the money that is rightfully ours, that Albertans have contributed, I think that does send a very powerful message. And certainly when it comes to time to negotiate around that table called Canada, Alberta would have a lot more clout and a lot more leverage. Flat tax. This is one thing where I have said before, we need to reduce the amount of lobbyist activism, things that you're seeing right now where you get big corporations that just want their tax credits, subsidies. This is killing Canadians. And right here in Alberta, our premier had promised tax reductions. She hasn't done that, something that would have certainly addressed a lot of the affordability and helped. But, no more subsidies. We have to stop subsidizing businesses. In my opinion, the government has no right to be in the business of business. The government is supposed to administer contracts. The criminal aspect of things is we need to start backing out of these social programs, and in particular when it favors a business, especially a large business, at the expense of many small businesses, which Canadians put their own money in, their own efforts in, and they're the tax dollar. That is where the production comes from. You have to remember, government doesn't produce anything. Government produces absolutely nothing, zero. Everything comes from the citizen, the taxpayer. So when people ask for a social program, what they're asking is for the taxpayer to fund their pet project. And what I would rather see is the government stay out of business, stay out of the lives of the individual, and allow people to spend their dollars where they value it most. If it's important enough to lobby the government to spend on it, well then, you know what, that is something you yourself should be willing to put your own dollars into. I may disagree, and I shouldn't be forced to have to fund something you agree with and I don't necessarily do. So, how do you think a flat tax would actually work? Some of the concerns around this were that, it negatively impacts lower income, but not necessarily, because we can actually establish what the median income is per household to fund, either a mortgage or rent, your groceries each and every month, utility costs, add all those up, and if that's $60,000 or $70,000 per household, well then that's exactly what it is, and that would be the only one exemption to a flat tax. And then after that, you'd pick a rate, everybody pays the same. And people go, oh, well, the rich wouldn't pay. The rich are paying now, but they're paying lawyers and accountants to avoid having to pay taxes. And it is, contrary to popular belief, perfectly legal to avoid paying taxes. As a matter of fact, that is your obligation and your duty as a citizen to avoid paying more than you should. So these wealthy corporations, these wealthy families have, a barrage of lawyers and accountants that help them to avoid paying more taxes than is necessary. It's just the middle income individual and the lower income people who don't have access to this kind of resource. But if the tax system was fair and it was low enough, say 8-10%, it's not worth it to have to dole out hundreds of thousands of dollars in structuring trusts or other forms of, avoiding taxes. You just pay the tax. Right? So I think that it would actually increase revenues for the province and for Canada if we were to implement something like this. And Canada would become a far more attractive place to do business, right? So, let me know what your thoughts are on that. Again, leave me a comment. The other one that, with some of the institutions and the organizations I've been working with, is immigration reform. We have had Canada just open the borders and let everybody and anybody in. This has not worked. They're doing it to mask their poor policies economically. They're looking at using it to boost GDP numbers, because they can now turn around and say, oh, look, Canada is growing economically. Our standard of living is declining. And that is a direct result of the immigration policies and allowing just anybody in to the province, into the country. So instead of waiting for Ottawa to address these issues, I think it's important for the provinces. It is jointly a jurisdiction that is shared immigration, but that does not mean that the provinces don't have the ability to control some of the immigration policies. Here in Alberta, our premier rolled out the red carpet. Alberta is calling campaign, which was a mistake. It's just too many people, too fast economically. And then we also have to understand that we have infrastructure that needs to keep up, whether it be education, healthcare, roads, housing. But we also have to understand that it has to be based upon economic need, right? If you're going to bring people in because we have a shortage of doctors, we have a shortage of nurses, then they need to be doctors and nurses. We can't be bringing in people to the country that we cannot viably provide them with a means of taking care of themselves and finding employment. So again, Alberta taking control of its own immigration system. This has been a big thing for me in particular. And that's my thoughts. What are your thoughts? Let me know. So, there's a sense of urgency here. We've gone on long enough. We've got to figure out what exactly we are going to do. We need to propose real solutions. And we've covered a lot today, everything. We've talked about separation, federal policies that are hurting Alberta. We've talked about the rural-urban divide. We've talked about some solutions that could help shelter, protect Alberta moving forward. Canada is changing. Alberta is changing. And unfortunately, we can't wait. We've got to have real solutions to discuss how we strengthen either our Alberta autonomy and get Canada back on track, either that or maybe the only alternative is to find other solutions. And maybe one of those solutions, just like Quebec had proposed, is maybe that is separation. I don't know. You let me know. What do you think? What does the future of Canada hold? What is the future of Alberta within Canada? What is the future of Alberta maybe on its own without Canada? Should we be pushing harder for independence, or is there still hope that Alberta can find a path forward with Canada? We are going to be talking to Dr. Michael Wagner, who his kind of comments is it's time to leave, and he thinks that by having greater autonomy and potentially even separating from Canada, maybe that is the proper model, and maybe that is how we save Canada in general. So thank you all. The future of Alberta sits in your hands. It sits in my hands, right? We're the ones who have the ability to put public pressure on our politicians to make policy happen and to change the direction if we are not happy with it. But it takes you and it takes me for getting actively involved. And you can't do that from the sofa. So help me out, get involved, share your comments. Have a great night. God bless.